Café Nocturne was a quaint coffee shop nestled in a quiet part of town, known for its unique coffee blends and late-night hours. One stormy night, David, a freelance writer, decided to spend the evening there, hoping to find inspiration for his latest project. The rain pounded against the windows as he entered, the cozy warmth inside a stark contrast to the chill outside. The shop was almost empty, save for a young woman sitting in a corner, scribbling in a notebook, and the barista, a tall, gaunt man named Victor, who was polishing the espresso machine. David ordered a dark roast and settled at a table near the back, his laptop open in front of him. As the night wore on, David struggled to focus. He felt an inexplicable sense of unease, as if he were being watched. He glanced around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The young woman continued writing, and Victor busied himself behind the counter. A sudden clap of thunder shook the building, and the lights flickered. For a brief moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When the lights returned, David noticed something strange. The reflection in his laptop screen showed an additional figure standing behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. Shaking off the chill that ran down his spine, David tried to concentrate on his work, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. He looked up and saw the young woman staring at him, her eyes wide with fear. She quickly looked away when their eyes met, her hand trembling as she wrote. David decided to take a break and walk to the counter for a refill. "Busy night?" he asked Victor, trying to make small talk. Victor looked up, his eyes cold and distant. "You could say that," he replied, his voice devoid of warmth. As David returned to his seat, he noticed the young woman was gone. Her notebook lay open on the table, filled with frantic scribbles and disturbing drawings of shadowy figures. His unease turned to dread as he recognized the same figure he had seen in his laptop reflection. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and the air grew colder. David's breath became visible in the chilling air. He felt a presence behind him and turned to see Victor standing unnaturally still, his eyes fixed on David. "They're here," Victor whispered, his voice echoing with an otherworldly resonance. Before David could react, the shadows in the room began to shift and coalesce, forming dark, twisted shapes. The figures from the drawings emerged, their eyes glowing with malevolence. David backed away, his heart pounding in his chest, but the figures surrounded him, their whispers filling his mind with terror. He ran to the door, but it wouldn't open. He pounded on it desperately, but it was as if the door had fused with the frame. The shadows closed in, their cold, clammy hands reaching for him. David screamed, a sound drowned out by the storm raging outside. The next morning, the storm had passed, and Café Nocturne opened its doors to the morning rush. The staff found David's laptop and notes on the table, but there was no sign of him. Victor greeted the new customers with his usual detached demeanor, as if nothing unusual had happened. But if you listened closely, amidst the hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine, you could hear faint whispers and feel a lingering chill in the air. David was never seen again, and Café Nocturne continued to serve its patrons, a silent witness to the dark presence that claimed those who stayed too late. The Moonlight Coffee House was known for its serene ambience and excellent brews, making it a favorite spot for night owls. One Friday night, Sarah decided to visit to catch up on some reading. She arrived around midnight, the shop almost empty except for a few regulars and the barista, an older woman named Margaret. Sarah ordered her usual latte and found a seat in the back corner, where she could read in peace. The soft jazz playing in the background added to the cozy atmosphere, and for a while, she was completely absorbed in her book. Suddenly, the lights flickered, breaking her concentration. She looked up, noticing the other patrons glancing around nervously. Margaret seemed unfazed as she continued wiping down the counter. The lights stabilized, and Sarah shrugged off the incident. A few minutes later, she felt a chill run down her spine. She looked up and saw a dark figure standing just outside the shop, barely visible through the window. It seemed to be staring directly at her. Sarah's heart pounded, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. She tried to refocus on her book, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The lights flickered again, this time going out completely for a few seconds. In the darkness, Sarah thought she heard whispering, but she couldn't make out any words. When the lights came back on, everything seemed normal, but the other patrons were gone. It was just her and Margaret now. Sarah stood up and approached the counter. "Did you see those people leave?" she asked. Margaret looked up, her eyes tired but kind. "People come and go. Nothing unusual about that." Sarah nodded, though something about Margaret's response didn't sit right with her. She returned to her seat, but the uneasy feeling grew stronger. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. She could now make out her name being called softly, over and over. Panicking, Sarah grabbed her things and headed for the door. But as she reached it, the whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the door slammed shut, refusing to budge. She turned back to Margaret, who was now standing motionless, staring at her with a cold, emotionless expression. "You can't leave, Sarah," Margaret said, her voice layered with a chorus of others. Sarah's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? Let me out." "They won't let you leave," Margaret continued. "You've been chosen." The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, coalescing into dark, humanoid shapes. They advanced slowly, their eyes glowing with a sinister light. Sarah backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The whispers became unbearable, filling her mind with dread. As the shadowy figures closed in, Sarah's screams echoed through the coffee shop. Margaret watched impassively as the darkness enveloped Sarah, dragging her into an abyss from which there was no escape. The next morning, the Moonlight Coffee House opened as usual. The regulars returned, unaware of the events that transpired the night before. Margaret greeted them with her usual warm smile, as if nothing had happened. But if you listened closely, you could still hear faint whispers and see fleeting shadows out of the corner of your eye. Sarah was never seen again, and the Moonlight Coffee House continued to serve its customers, a silent witness to the dark forces lurking within its walls. It was a rainy evening when Mark stumbled into the small coffee shop on the corner of Maple Street. He was soaked to the bone, shivering as he approached the counter. The barista, a young woman named Lisa, greeted him with a warm smile. "Rough night?" she asked. "Yeah, you could say that," Mark replied, brushing the rain from his coat. "Just a coffee, please, black." As Lisa prepared his drink, Mark took a seat by the window. The shop was nearly empty, save for an elderly man sitting in the corner, reading a newspaper. The rain pounded against the windows, creating a soothing yet eerie ambience. Lisa brought his coffee over and set it down. "Here you go. Anything else I can get you?" Mark shook his head. "No, thanks. This is perfect." He sipped his coffee and stared out into the rainy night. Suddenly, he noticed something odd. The reflection in the window showed more than just himself and the barista. There were shadowy figures moving about the shop, figures that weren't there when he turned around. "Did you see that?" Mark asked Lisa, pointing at the window. Lisa glanced over, her face paling. "See what?" "Those shadows. People," Mark insisted. But when he looked again, they were gone. Lisa tried to reassure him. It's probably just the rain playing tricks on your eyes. Mark nodded, though uneasily. He resumed drinking his coffee, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The elderly man in the corner seemed to sense his unease and looked up, giving Mark a knowing glance before returning to his newspaper. As the night wore on, the atmosphere in the coffee shop grew increasingly tense. The lights flickered, and the air felt heavy. Mark's unease turned to dread when he noticed the reflection again. This time, the shadowy figures were clearer, and they were all staring directly at him. Panicking, Mark stood up abruptly. "What is happening here?" Lisa looked frightened now. "I don't know, but maybe you should leave." Mark grabbed his coat and rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. He pulled harder, but it was as if the door was sealed shut. He turned back to see Lisa and the elderly man standing side by side, their expressions blank. "You can't leave," the old man said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "They won't let you." "Who?" Mark shouted. "Who won't let me?" Before the old man could answer, the shadowy figures materialized around Mark, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They reached out, cold hands grasping him, pulling him away from the door. Lisa and the old man watched silently as Mark was dragged into the darkness that seemed to swallow the back of the shop. His screams echoed briefly before being snuffed out, leaving an eerie silence. The next morning, the coffee shop was bustling with customers as usual. Lisa was back behind the counter, serving coffee with her usual smile. No one noticed the faint, desperate whispers that lingered in the corners of the room, or the faint reflection of a terrified man in the windows. Mark was never seen again, and the coffee shop continued its business, oblivious to the dark secret it harbored within its walls. Late one evening, Emma decided to catch up on some work at Brood Awakening, the local coffee shop known for its cozy atmosphere and extended hours. It was nearing midnight, and she was the only customer left. The barista, a quiet man named Paul, was cleaning the counter and occasionally glancing at her. Emma's focus was interrupted by a faint whispering sound. She looked around, but the shop was empty except for Paul. She shrugged it off, attributing it to her tired mind. However, the whispering grew louder, forming indistinct words that seemed to emanate from the corners of the room. Uneasy, she tried to ignore it and continued typing on her laptop. The lights flickered, and Emma's screen went black. She glanced at Paul, who was now standing still, staring at her with a blank expression. The whispering escalated into a cacophony of voices, all overlapping and filled with desperation and malice. Emma's heart raced as she frantically tried to restart her laptop, but it remained unresponsive. Paul moved closer, his footsteps eerily silent on the tiled floor. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice oddly distorted, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. Emma stammered, I think there's something wrong with the lights and my laptop." Paul's face twisted into a grotesque smile. "It's not the lights or the laptop. It's them," he said, pointing towards the shadows in the far corner of the room. Emma turned to look, and to her horror, she saw dark, humanoid figures slowly emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing with a sinister light. She backed away, but the figures moved closer, the whispering now a deafening roar in her ears. Paul's smile widened as he watched her panic. "They've been waiting for you, Emma. You shouldn't have stayed so late." Emma bolted towards the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. The figures were almost upon her, their outstretched hands reaching for her. She screamed, banging on the door, hoping someone outside might hear her. As the first figure touched her shoulder, a cold, paralyzing fear surged through her body. She was pulled back into the darkness, her screams silenced by the overwhelming presence of the entities. The next morning, the staff found the coffee shop in perfect order, except for Emma's laptop, which sat on the table with a single sentence typed on the screen: "She will never leave." Brood Awakening reopened as usual, but Emma was never seen again. Some say her spirit now joins the whispering voices, warning late-night customers to leave before it's too late.